Hey guys, we are going over the Phillips curve worksheet, which we started on in class today. Unit 2.3, Macroeconomic Objectives, the Phillips curve, practice activity. So on every scenario, you're starting at long-run equilibrium, which they help you start off on letter A. It says the economy is stable with unemployment at 5% and inflation at 3%. So remember, our Phillips curve has inflation on the y-axis, unemployment on the x-axis. We have short-run Phillips curve, downward sloping, and long-run Phillips curve, completely vertical, just like long-run aggregate supply. Where they intersect is the full employment long-run equilibrium. And on letter A, it tells us what to label it as: 5% unemployment and 3% inflation. So every scenario you have to ask yourself, what happens to aggregate supply and demand? Because remember, aggregate supply shifting causes a shift of the Phillips curve just in the opposite direction, and aggregate demand shifting causes a movement on the short-run Phillips curve in kind of an opposite-ish direction. Okay, so on A, you just want to label the long-run equilibrium and label that A. B, a decrease of interest rates causes investment to increase. Investment is an aggregate demand shifter. More investment, more aggregate demand. Aggregate demand shifts to the right. Of course, that raises prices and lowers unemployment, so that's going to be a movement upward on the short-run Phillips curve. We're going to label that point B because that's the scenario B, just like this. Okay, we start off at A again on C. An appreciation of the nation's currency, you now know what that is, leads foreigners to demand less of a country's exports. So net exports is falling, and that's an aggregate demand shifter. Aggregate demand shift causes a movement on the short-run Phillips curve, but this time it's going down. Because if aggregate demand is shifting leftward, prices are going to lower, and so is GDP, which means unemployment rate is going to go up. That was scenario C, so we're going to have a new point. Downward, just downward and to the right movement on the short-run Phillips curve. Letter D. The discovery of large resources of natural gas causes energy prices to decline. Energy is an input, and the price of this input just changed, so that's the supply shifter. If energy is cheaper, you can produce more. So aggregate supply is going to shift to the right, but remember, that's going to be a leftward shift of the short-run Phillips curve. So it doesn't really matter how you label it. I'm just going to draw a leftward shift. Don't forget your arrow so you know where you're going. And then just have a point on that line be labeled D, or you can label the entire line D is fine. I did that. Alright, E. An earthquake strikes, destroying much of the nation's transportation infrastructure. So there's less roads, less bridges. It's probably going to stop production if there's just infrastructure. That sounds like a supply shock to me. So aggregate supply is going to shift to the left, which would be a rightward shift of the short-run Phillips curve, because inflation and unemployment are both bad things, and so if you have a leftward shift of aggregate supply, that's not good for anything. That's like the worst type of shift, and so you're having more of two bad things: more inflation and more unemployment. And that entire line shifts to the right, the short-run Phillips curve, and you can label that line. Okay, now I'm going to be upsetting people with like ADD. Or OCD really, because I labeled it here for the line, but then this other one I labeled it here, and that's going to bother some people. Oh well. F, energy prices decline, harming consumer and investor confidence. People are going to be spending less money. It's going to be an aggregate demand shift. And if we're starting at A every time, an aggregate demand shift to the left, lowering price level and real GDP, then wherever you put C before situation C is probably going to be where situation F is going to go. So that's where I put it. There you go. G, the government reduces payroll taxes by 2% for all households. Taxes are cheaper or taxes are lower. We have more disposable income. We can buy more things, so we will. Aggregate demand shift to the right, which will be a movement up on the short-run Phillips curve. So right next to situation B, we're going to be adding the new situation of G. BG. All right, H. Fear over the national debt forced governments to reduce its budget deficit. Okay, a budget deficit is when the government spends more money than it has. So right now they've decided to reduce its overspending. So they're cutting its spending. So government spending goes down. Aggregate demand shifts to the left. So it's going to be a movement once again on the short run Phillips curve. But once again, it's going to be a movement downward. So it's going to be C, comma, F, comma, H is the scenario that we just graphed. H right there by C and F. I, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, requires all the nation's producers to adhere to strict new greenhouse gas emission standards, which is going to affect the level of production. Anytime there's government regulation, it typically hurts production because it costs money to now follow these regulations that they didn't have to before. Aggregate supply is going to shift to the left, which means short run Phillips curve is going to shift to the right. We already have one there. It's graph line E, so we're just going to add the new scenario of I right next to E. EI. EI. J. Looser immigration laws increase the available supply of labor in the country. It says increase the supply. If aggregate supply shifts to the right, then short run Phillips curve is shifting to the left. We already have one there. It's line D for situation D. So we're going to be adding J to it. DJ. And last one, rapid economic growth abroad boosts tourist demand for the nation's output. So it sounds like XN is going up, which is an aggregate demand shifter, which is going to be a movement on the short run Phillips curve upwards and to the left. So it's B, G, and our last situation is K. So here's what it should look like when you're done. Alright, so hopefully that wasn't too difficult. Every time that you think that something's happening to aggregate supply and demand, just know that in some alternate universe that the Phillips curve is also changing, but not necessarily in the way that you think. So there's always absolutes. Short run aggregate supply will shift the Phillips curve. Aggregate demand shifts will move the Phillips curve. Just think about what the other graph looks like, and you can basically figure it out yourself. But we're going to do some more practice tomorrow in class. If you have any questions, tweet me, leave a message, email me, remind through Remind 101 me, or snail mail me, or just see me tomorrow in class, before class, or after class. Have a good day.